All right, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our panel on our new report from Niskanen, Left Out, a framework for non-contributory paid parental leave. I'm Leah Sargent. I'm a senior policy analyst in family economic security here at Niskanen, and I'm joined by my colleague, Joshua McCabe, the director of social policy at Niskanen, as well as Stephanie Murray, a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and Elliot Haspel, a senior fellow at Capita. We're excited to have you gather today because the topic of paid family leave is, I think, especially on everyone's mind today after Mother's Day, which may or may not have been a day of leave in your own households. But we really want to have a time to focus on what we can do to support new parents, the full variety of programs that are available to offer, especially in the weeks and months following the birth of a baby, the time that's most important for parental healing, bonding, and the establishment of new routines. We want to make sure that families have the opportunity to support their children and to help their whole family get through that difficult transition without sacrificing their family's short-term or long-term economic security. There are a variety of paid family leave programs available internationally, and as countries and some states in the US have tried to tackle this problem, there's always the important question of who gets left out from these programs. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about our report on a non-contributory program to cover the people who might otherwise be left out from well-intentioned programs that can't cover all parents, especially the most vulnerable, with responses from Elliot and Stephanie about what it takes to support parents today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Josh to give an overview of our report.
Great. Thank you, Lee. And thank everyone for joining us here today. And thank you to our panelists for engaging in what I'm sure will be an insightful discussion on supporting new parents and their children. I'm a big fan of Stephanie and Ellie's work and supporting parents more broadly. So I'm really happy to have them here. As Leah mentioned, the weeks and months following the birth of a new child are truly a special time for parents. For first-time parents in particular, it's an opportunity to bond with their baby, improve their caregiving skills, and develop a healthy foundation for attachment. I remember the birth of my oldest child and our excitement at her arrival. It was a day that changed my life for the better. But I also remember some of the concerns and trepidation around work-life balance. So we were up in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts now has a contributory paid family leave program, but it didn't exist at the time. My wife worked for a large university, which allowed her to save up vacation and sick days over the years to use as a form of paid parental leave. But I just finished up grad school and started a job that summer. So I had no mechanism for taking time off without losing any income with the birth of our child. The advent of Massachusetts paid family leave would mean my wife would be eligible for parental benefits to replace some of her wages, so she could save sick time and vacation days for when she really needed them, which, as you might know, we did need them in the days and months that followed. But even if I had had access to this program at the time, I still wouldn't have been eligible because my situation, I did not have the requisite work history, and I would have been left out of this program, which was a godsend for so many new parents in Massachusetts. So this was on my mind as we set out to write this report, which I authored with David Trimmer, who was an intern at Niskanen at the time. And as we wrote this report, I found out that I wasn't alone in this situation. Contributory paid family leave programs are great. 13 states now have them, and we need the other 37 to follow suit. But they also have important limitations that require us to think outside the box if we really want universal access for parents to spend time with their newborns. State contributory programs, if you're not too familiar with them, are financed by payroll taxes and pay benefits as a portion of previous wages. We usually talk about the wage replacement rate. And this structure has been very successful and very common. We use it for old age pensions and unemployment benefits. Social Security runs like this. It's premised on beneficiaries meeting some minimum work history requirements, usually in the form of minimum earnings requirements or minimum hours requirements. This is something we see again with Social Security, with unemployment insurance. And the majority of potential new parents can meet these requirements, but a substantial portion cannot. In Massachusetts, for example, we estimated that about a quarter of 18 to 45-year-olds would not meet the $6,000 annual earnings requirement to be eligible for this program. We saw this across a number of states. Usually about a quarter, and in some cases, we're not going to be eligible if they had a baby 9 months from then. A majority of these folks we found had some earnings or were in school. That was me. My child was born, but not enough to meet the minimum requirements. I had income. I was in school, but I still wasn't eligible. So this isn't uncommon in other countries. About a quarter of new moms in Canada, for example, are not eligible for paid parental leave for this reason. One common refrain is that those parents don't need or deserve it because it's a wage replacement program and they've got no wages to replace. And that makes a lot of sense from the narrow standpoint of that program. But again, that's a narrow conceptualization of what I think our broader goal should be, which is supporting new parents in all their different circumstances. From an economic security perspective, lost wages are only part of the equation. The other side of the coin is a rise in expenses when a baby arrives. People without expensive work histories, whether recent graduates, stay-at-home parents, still face these rising costs and the pressures they put on their families' finances. And we think they need and deserve support as well. So what can we do about new parents left out of these contributory programs? A good option is to pair the expansion of these contributory programs with non-contributory options for those who are left out. In the report, we explore two approaches. One uses tax credits and one uses block grants to states. The first one we got from Australia, whose primary program does have minimum work history requirements, but it's also paired with a secondary, what's often called the baby bonus program, that provides a less generous, they call a newborn supplement for new parents ineligible for the primary program. This effectively ensures universal access to support for new parents. And in the US, there's been several proposals that would provide new parents with a child tax credit top-off upon the birth of a child. This would give all new parents some financial space to stay at home with their newborn by relieving some of the pressure to immediately go back to work. So there's tax credit proposals out there right now. We talk more about them in the report. The second comes from our state histories. So decades ago, several states piloted what were called at-home infant care programs, where new parents could otherwise be eligible for childcare subsidies while they work, could instead opt to receive direct cash payments to stay at home with their newborn for several weeks after they're born. Federal support for these programs was pretty limited, but we've seen a rebirth and interest in fixing the structure of this original program by allowing states to tap into TANF funds, to childcare entitlement to the state block grant funds, to try out new programs. I think it would have a similar impact, relieving some pressure to immediately go back to work for parents. The best part of all this is that these proposals have some measure of bipartisan support insofar as we've seen what I would consider sort of Democratic flavored versions and Republican flavored versions of each one. So I think the next step is to try to broaden this conversation about paid leave to one about supporting new parents in whatever circumstances they find themselves. So I'm looking forward to starting that conversation with Leah, Stephanie, and Elliot today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm going to turn things over to Elliot for his thoughts and response.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Leah. It's great to be here. I really appreciated Josh putting together this report. I will say I broadly agree with Josh's point here. I think any policy when you're missing a quarter of the intended beneficiaries probably means something has gone awry in your policy design. But I think the last thing Josh said is really important to put a point on, which is, broadly speaking, what are we trying to do here? Who is the benefit of paid family leave for? And my colleague at Capita, Joe Waters, is fond of saying, if you look at Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he talks about the difference between policy and programs, right? Policy is a comprehensive set of different strategies that you're trying to get at large scale goals. Programs are discrete ways to get at specific pieces of those goals. And paid family leave is a program, but the idea of centering family and child flourishing and all of the diversity of American families, that is something that we've never at the national level had a policy around in the United States. And I think you see that here, because when you pull out to the idea of we want all children and families to be able to flourish. We want there to truly be self-determination and choice and freedom inherent in those family structures so that families can do what they need to do, for parents to feel to have good mental and physical well-being, for them to feel like they've got a work and care situation that's working for them, letting them be the parents that they want to be, letting them, pass on their values and traditions the way that they want to. Like that, those are deep first principles, which suggests that we need to be on some level agnostic about whether or not the new parent is actually, attached formally to the labor force at a certain level. So that's sort of the highest level. I think that, it is striking when Josh talks about in the paper, how slight changes in design can capture enormous numbers of beneficiaries. So he talks about in Canada, nationwide, about 2/3 of families of new parents are able to access paid leave, but Quebec, which went its own ways, it often does, put into place a much lower threshold to pass, and they had almost 90% of their new parents receiving benefits. I think that's a powerful example of how policy design here really, really matters. So I would strongly support the idea of thinking about some kind of secondary benefit. I also think we can think about it with minimum friction. So this is something that our friend Matt Brunig on the political left talks about a lot, right? That sort of the minute you put friction in place, the people who inevitably are going to fall into the cracks tend to be those who are on the lower income end of the spectrum. And so, rather, if you put zero, requirements in place, that might actually be the ideal, and then you kind of go from there. So you can go from, I think, from one of two angles. You can say, all right, we're going to have the sort of program A or policy A, which has requirements, and then we're going to bring in a supplementary policy B, or you can say we're just going to make sure policy A doesn't have any requirements that are onerous, and that we're going to be able to reach a maximum number of people. We see this in childcare as well. I'll just note, which is my sort of area of most expertise. So a few countries, Finland, Norway, Germany, they have deeply subsidized public childcare systems. They also have what's called a home care stipend. So if your child is under the age of 2 or 3, you can receive basically a cash stipend every month, which is similar to what Josh described, the at-home infant care option. So I think that's something we should be looking at more broadly in policy. And then the last thing I'll say is a lot of this gets at the question, I think, of stay-at-home parents. So about 1/3 of children under the age of 5, and disproportionately infants and toddlers, are primarily cared for by a parent. And we see them being left out in lots of different ways. This is one. Childcare, because of external childcare benefits, is another. I'll also mention here, my colleague Ivana Greco has written eloquently about how, if it's something like access to Social Security disability insurance, you don't get that also as an earnings requirement there, various retirement plans. So I just think we have to really pull back and say, if we're going to center families and children, that's going to require a really comprehensive approach. In many other countries, we can learn from. And I think that for this particular discussion, we really should think about how do we maximize access to paid leave so that parents and children, both can benefit from that, which in turn does strengthen entire family units. It strengthens neighborhoods. It strengthens communities. It does strengthen the economy. But my argument has long been like those benefits in some ways are a positive externality rather than the core reason why we should do something like have a strong paid leave policy.
Thank you so much. And then on to Stephanie.
Yes, I'll just reiterate, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here, honored to be here among all these distinguished family policy thinkers. So yeah, I'll just get right into it. I think that there are two groups of parents that typical contributory paid parental leave programs fail almost inevitably. The first are people who are left out of these programs but need them for the same reason that people who actually get them do, which is that they need an income during a time when they really shouldn't be working. They should be at home with their child. Sometimes we, Josh and Elliot have already touched on this, we're talking about people who are working, right? But they just for some reason, they don't qualify because of the restrictions in place. I interviewed once a woman who worked as a home health aide when she was pregnant, and her clients were all people with pretty severe intellectual disabilities. And so it was sort of by its nature, a fairly dangerous, physically intense job. Sometimes they hit her. And so as a pregnant woman, she left her job and found a new one, which was wonderful. But then the fact that she started this new job mid-pregnancy, around five months pregnant or something like that, that disqualified her from FMLA, and it would have qualified her from some of the state paid parental leave programs, just because she started mid-pregnancy. There are a bunch of other examples. Self-employed people actually they can run into trouble accessing paid parental leave. They can technically get it in most states, but it's hard to do so. But then other times we're talking about people who left a job. They intentionally left a job, right? They're actually not working, but they left it for a good reason, right? And one obvious example that we're all really familiar with it was during the pandemic, right? There was people who left jobs to deal with remote schooling. I once interviewed a nurse who had to leave her job in order to take on, you can't work from home when you're a nurse, right? And so that was an enormous strain on her family to handle that, right? But there are tons of other examples that you don't need a pandemic for that sort of thing to happen. And it's not just kids either. People leave the labor market to care for children, elderly relatives. There are lots of good reasons to leave the labor market for a time. And these people they're all making good decisions that we want people to make. Yet their good decision would then put them in a very financially vulnerable situation were they to get pregnant. It might mean that they further delay their return to the labor market, and thus sort of the financial strain that goes along with not being in it, because they know, well, I'm pregnant and I won't have paid parental leave and I'll have to be at home. What am I going to do? Or they do return to work. They know they won't qualify for paid parental leave, and then they just sort of suck it up and return to work at 10 days or whatever it is. So I think in general, building a family policy framework that assumes that leaving a job is universally bad will inevitably either punish people for making decisions that we want them to make, good decisions, or it will coerce them into making decisions we really don't want them to make. So then that's one thing. But then I also think there's this other second group of people that are often overlooked in this sort of discussion. And those are people where the concern isn't really that they'll end up stocking shelves 10 days postpartum, but those who don't really have much readily available support, familial support, community support in the early newborn period. So I'll use myself as an example here. I left my job when my second daughter was born, which was not a huge financial problem for me because my husband has a good job. I'm married and he has a good job. He had a week or two or something of paid parental leave, and then, which was awesome. But then beyond that, I was on my own. And my neighborhood was pretty much from 7 a.m. in the morning until 6 p.m. just a ghost town because everybody was working. There was no one who was around. There were no other stay-at-home moms. And there was really no one around at all. And that was very, very difficult. So I think there's a tendency sometimes to overlook what's lost when labor force participation rises. Every time someone joins the formal labor force, that's another person who isn't around to hold a baby so that a new mom next door can, take a shower or a nap or whatever it is. And so while I think it's really sad and strange and in some ways really dangerous, that not all mothers have the opportunity to stay home with their children, to recover, to bond with their newborn during that really early time. I also think it's kind of weird and sad and strange that the mothers who are often alone, entirely on their own during this very labor intensive time period. So I think when we think about, as Josh said, the sort of expenses that arise in that early newborn period, I don't think we should overlook the expense of purchasing the kind of support that would be more readily available if fewer people were working, and that expense is certainly not isolated to parents who are employed.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I have a few questions for our panelists myself, but I'd like to invite all our attendees to feel free to submit questions through the Q&A, which I'll mix in among my own. So I think I'd like to ask, first of all, for both other countries that have expanded this kind of safety net, and for states that are looking at this, I feel like I've heard all of you talk about, who is this benefit for? Is this a benefit that's for the parent qua worker, for the parent qua person who's now experiencing this expansion in their costs that we want to support? Or is paid family leave a benefit primarily for the baby, where we're giving the money to the parent as the person who's able to receive and spend and steward it, but the baby's qualification is primarily being a baby, and that's something all babies are prepared to do from day one. So, Josh, maybe starting a little with you, when you look at the history of that Australian stopgap, how does this play in, this question of who is this benefit for, as people put together coalitions to cover more parents and more children?
Yeah, so this where it gets tricky, and how you define it really influences what folks see as some of those goals, as we talked about here. So we frame it as supporting new parents, and I think implicitly in my mind, supporting parents means supporting newborns as well, right? So that newborns do best when they have access to their parents in those first few weeks. But we also want to recognize that different parents are going to have different goals and come from different circumstances. But we shouldn't let that shape who we see overall is deserving of something like this. So if we assume that the interests of the baby are having a parent home, rather than the interests of the parents are balancing it, or labor force participation, or any other thing, then I think we see the beauty of making universal access. And I love how Elliot mentioned policies versus programs, that some programs are really good for some goals, but as a policy of universal access of newborns to their parents, that we need something a little bit more broad.
Stephanie or Elliot?
I mean, I mostly echo what Josh said. I think it is very difficult to take the well-being of a newborn outside of the well-being of their parents. And I've not had the experience of having a baby, of birthing a baby, but my understanding from my wife, having watched her go through that, and it is something that you do not want to be rushing back from, right? Like, it's going to, we know this, study after study after study, if not just common sense and human experience tells us that is going to negatively affect the well-being of the parent, and therefore is going to negatively affect the well-being of the child. Sometimes I think we get, and I actually think there's more agreement on this than we may think there is. Sometimes we get caught in like that childcare debate around like, what do you do with infants? And I sometimes say, when you go to other countries, most other peer nations, and you look for the infants in childcare centers, there are none, because they're all home with their parents. All right, I think we should probably emphasize, like, the United States is such a massive outlier among high income nations in our overall lack of any national paid leave policy to begin with. There's a great New York Times map from, I think it's 2021, and it's us and like Papua New Guinea. It's like literally they don't have any national paid leave. And even then, even the ask that most advocates make around national paid leave is very, very low compared to international standards, right? Like, could we please have 8 or 12 weeks, and most international peer countries are at close up to a year. So I think that context is probably important. But what I think is interesting is those countries haven't, to answer your question kind of in a roundabout way, those countries' economies have not fallen into the sea. Right. Like, I not think the strength of American entrepreneurship and innovation is the fact that we're rushing back a quarter of new mothers within the first 6 weeks of giving birth. So on some level, I think we have to challenge the premise of that question of, even if you thought it was for the economy, like, is it actually the benefits of that outweighing the costs that we're forcing on new families and the short and medium and long run effects those have. But yeah, I mean, again, if strong American families make for strong communities and a strong nation and strong economy, then that should start with universal access to some form of paid leave, and with as few barriers as possible for those critical bonding times.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree. The only thing I'd add is I guess I think that um obviously I think it's useful to think about, to sort of reframe the way, because I do think there's a trap of thinking about family policy only from the perspective of parents, because then it's almost too easy to fall into the trap of like the decisions they are making. And so it can be really useful to think about it as a benefit for a child, right? And think, well, the child didn't make any decisions, right? And so maybe we could think of this as a form of insurance against, the type of parent that they get, right? You can do that, right? But then, of course, I also think inevitably, as has already been said, that, you can't actually support children without supporting the parent. And so, yeah, I think that, um, you know, those two things are just, there is no family policy framework where you would be supporting children without really taking into consideration the needs of the parents. And so they just kind of go together.
Oh, that's why
Yeah,
I'd like to ask you. Oh, go for it,
can I tack
Elliot.
on one other thing to that too?
Yeah.
Like, I think, Stephanie, that reminded me of a point, which is I think we'd be remiss to go any further in this conversation without not mentioning that there are some pretty strong racial dynamics into which who gets this kind of access to this kind of leave, right? Because of overlays with poverty, but also for a very long time in this country, there has been a two-track sort of approach to which mothers are we okay with staying home and not working? Which mothers do we want actually okay? And that goes all the way back to enslaved Black women and girls being, forced to care for the children of their enslavers while their own children were frequently neglected. Like, so, and there's a long history of women of color, mothers of color working with very little public support. And so I do think that, is not just who is it for, like in a sense of is it for the parent, is it for the child, but like which parents and which children. So I want that kind of add that contour to this discussion as well.
And that actually leads exactly into what I wanted to ask next, which is, we have these huge numbers of people being excluded from the baseline programs when they've been set up. In some cases, it feels like that's a deliberate choice, even if the values escape me a little bit of no students should be eligible for support when they have a baby, right? But in other cases, we have these kind of very arbitrary cliffs for support for new parents. I've changed jobs while pregnant, which immediately makes me ineligible for FMLA leave. It's up to my employer whether I have leave, but it certainly can handcuff parents to a job when they know that they're pregnant and will lose benefits if they change work that they've earned at their current job. I know in one case, there's a woman who wrote up her experience for The Guardian of seeking an abortion because she knew she was ineligible by a few months for FMLA and thought her best choice was to, terminate her pregnancy and start over when she might be eligible. So I wanted to ask you guys a bit, what if any of these exclusions are aimed at a realistic patchwork of policy goals, that we might want to pursue those goals or incentives elsewhere, and which of these are just kind of a mess?
Yeah, so I think this is where I put on my comparative historical sociologist hat and realize a lot of stuff is just done in a very kludgy way. So one of our senior fellows, Steve Tellis, talks about American kludgocracy of you're just sort of trying to muddle through and build a patchwork from wherever you are at that moment. I think I'm probably relative to Elliot. I think sort of this idea of deserving this and sort of those racialized notions play less of a role in the US because when we look at other countries, you see the same sort of contributory pattern, right? And you see Canada does not have a secondary program. I think the UK has something smaller, but not so much. And Australia was the only sort of big liberal welfare regime that I found that had something like this. And it was very much an accident of history of like they started this program trying to delay a big paid leave program, ended up becoming a secondary program. So I think that this is part of the reason in this report we wanted to get folks thinking outside the box, because we often think from a very particular perspective. You go with what there's momentum for in a given situation, right? And we've all seen the stats of the US is the only country without some sort of contributory national paid family leave program. And that's great, but that also leaves out, these other programs aren't perfect. These other programs have these gaps that we want to acknowledge exist without necessarily saying paid leave is bad or something that we shouldn't do. But someone needs to be thinking about, how do we fill in these gaps, right? How do we, as you had mentioned, Matt Bruning's work on sort of minimal friction, how can we make it in a way that, you either get rid of work history requirements altogether, or you have like an Australian Centrelink where you apply for the first benefit. If you're not eligible, you get that second benefit and you can get it in one spot. So there's multiple ways to do there. I think there's sort of unique country histories that push us one way or the other. But we can't really tackle that unless we sort of acknowledge that it exists and that we need to find ways to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and I actually don't know, Josh, if you have particular insights on this as well, like we're seeing states pass like paid leave policies like today, right? Like, in the past year or two, and they're still falling into these, what I would call traps. And I don't know if that's just because, again, they're looking at what the states before them did. And so it's just a momentum thing. I don't know if they're trying to insulate themselves from potential political attacks, because we did see, we should probably name, right, like when Mitt Romney came out with his Family Security Act 1.0, it did not have work requirements for certain pieces of it, and that got assailed from certain quarters, and then he sort of iterated that. So I don't know if it's a political thing, although these are mostly blue states that are passing it. So I don't know, Josh, have you any thoughts on like are states just following the leader here?
Yeah, I think especially on the state level, you have staff who may not be full-time legislatures. They may not have a big professional staff. So a lot of folks are relying on outside folks who can run numbers and sort of tell them what might be a particularly good policy. But I also think we've seen this in the history of other countries where a lot of them started with a lot smaller programs. So if we think about US relative to other countries when they first started, on one hand, the duration's a lot shorter, but the US is sort of leapfrogged into comprehensive, where other countries would start with maternal and then paternal and then sort of tack on from there. So it gets, I think, a little trickier in terms of where we're ahead, where these are coming from. But I think in the US, there's a coalition built around prioritizing comprehensive in that basic contributory model. So trying to figure out, okay, who's going to fill in the gaps? How are we going to fill in the gaps? There's not a whole, I think, political movement pushing for that. So it just gets left to the wayside in some cases.
I think, so I tend to sort of prefer sort of the friction minimalist approach. And I do think that there is a risk in it, you can, I think Elliot said this already, right? You can try and build something that is like really universal, right? Just so that you avoid a situation where you really need some kind of like creating some other thing to catch the people who fall through the cracks. Or you can do what the US tends to do, I think, which is to sort of like try and zero in on the people that we think are deserving and need this. And then, okay, what do we do about all the other people, right? And I think that, I don't know, I see two problems with that latter approach. One is that even to the extent that a lot of other countries mimic it, right? They do have contributory programs. A lot of times they are broader, right? Even here in even if we're just talking about FMLA, right? Unpaid job protected leave. A continual sort of experience I've had, even in the UK, I would not hold the UK up as like the model of family policy. I don't think we should replicate it, but it's much easier to qualify for much more unpaid leave and having worked far less and for a particular employer for less long, right? And then same with pay, right? Even though they do have this sort of contributory model, what qualifies you for it just kicks in much sooner. And so that comes with outcomes that probably some in America won't like, right? You can either sort of skew in one direction where you're just kind of trying to catch as many people as possible, and inevitably, maybe you are going to catch some people that you personally think have made some bad decisions in their life, or maybe you just think that they really could have gone about it in a different way, right? But then you're also going to catch people that, fertility is not something that you can really plan that well, right? That we should not be, I personally don't think we should be building a family policy framework that assumes a high degree of control over your fertility, because even with modern contraceptive methods and all of that, this is just not how fertility works, right? And it's not how life works, right? Jobs are not just, you can't just go out and get whatever job it is that you think is good for, it would be best for having a child. Anyway, so I think there's a trade-off there. And to really build a program that supported people, you would kind of need to accept that some people that you think have made silly decisions are going to get it, But I just think there's value in taking that broader approach initially rather than, filtering out a bunch of people and then creating this secondary program to with the hope that they'll find it.
One question I have is we're kind of talking about this as a primary and secondary program, though of course in the US the primary program doesn't exist. It exists for a few states, but it really seems like we're talking in terms of tiers when on the ground what there are kind of dozens of tiers. We're talking about maybe putting in a floor, and then there's possibly a state program, maybe one day a federal program, many individual employers who may exceed whatever that is, a lot of different gaps between I work in this state, you work in that state, in the same industry. Now we're subject to different programs, but maybe the same national floor. You started a month after me, we're pregnant at the same time, we have completely different benefit structures. So I'm kind of curious as we talk about this as a fail-safe or a floor, what are the costs of having such a fragmented approach to paid family leave? We're talking about this as secondary, but it's secondary to a very complicated landscape.
I mean, well, I don't know if it's okay for me to go first, but my response to that is that I think that the complexity of getting any sort of support in America, it almost has like an impact on the feeling, the experience of like the precarity of having a child, right? I really think that they're probably the biggest value to me of having universal supports, that there's no way you can mess it up. There's no way that you can do something that prevents you from getting it. There's no, I think that offers, it's not just the income that offers you, it's also just sort of a sense of, yeah, a floor, a sense that there's a floor below you, that you can only fall so far. And I think, yeah, that's something that has value that really doesn't quite translate into dollars and cents. But one that I've experienced here in a different way. I didn't have a child here, but just a small example is the UK's childcare system is kind of a mess, but they have this sort of they do have a small amount of universal childcare that every child is entitled to, regardless of work situation, once they turn 3. And it's very easy to use. There's just no, like, you don't have to think about it at all, or jump through any hoops to get it. It's literally just, you go to a nursery, if they have room for you, they are getting this, they take the kid's name, pretty much, and then you get it. And I think that there was something shockingly reassuring to me about that, where it was sort of like, okay, if I did have another kid, I know that I would have this, right? That's kind of huge.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Stephanie. I think that this idea of when you are, the transition to parenthood is a well-established crucible moment, right? It can often change one's priorities, it can change one's politics, it can change one's sense of place in society, and it forces you to really reckon with like what support is there or isn't there. And when it is kludgy, like Josh says, when it's complicated, when it's hard, when it's not available, it does generate, I think, that sense not only of precarity and the riskiness is again the great risk shift stuff. Although to your point, Leah, there was no really alternative before in this case. But I think it puts you kind of in a defensive crouch as an individual towards in your relationship to government, in your relationship to society. This idea of I'm gonna Jess Keller-Kauer has the sociologist has a great book coming out next month. I'll plug it. It's called Holding It Together: How Women Became America's Safety Net. But she basically talks about this idea of a do-it-yourself society, right? Like it's a DIY society. Like if you're in that can be really it can be really dangerous. It can lead you to sort of warp your relationship with other people, with the neighborhood, with society more writ large. So I do think there are more ineffable implications here that we don't always think about when we're talking about the technical policy discussion. I'll say for all the issues that our American public education has, like that's one example, right? It's available to everyone. There's no waiting list. You go to your neighbor public school. Like if you don't, someone's gonna knock on your door and just make sure that like it's and people have different feelings about that, but the whole idea of it is like it is universal. And so I think here again, like the idea of how do we simplify things? The last thing I'll say is I lived in California when my eldest daughter was born, and my wife and I both had worked, and we were eligible for California's paid family leave policy, which was useful, but was not easy to like deal with the bureaucracy, the administrative burden of getting signed up and all of that. So really it is uh, that time tax is real on this. And when you're about getting ready for a newborn, that's about the last thing you have is more time.
Well, speaking of lacking more time, we're getting nearer the end of our webinar. So the question I really wanted to make, my last question to each of you is, we're talking about what it would take to put in a floor that can cover everyone. And I really like your points about the predictability itself being a gift to parents. When we're talking about a modest plan that can cover folks who don't qualify for more generous or expansive ones, we're not anticipating we're going to break the bank offering it. And we're not anticipating we're going to do something like completely close the gender gap or solve the 4-month sleep regression. So what are the kinds of modest family wins you'd expect to see for parents? What would they be free to do, or peril they'd avoid if they had this kind of fail safe to rely on?
Yeah, so I want to take that from sort of a macro perspective and then like an intermediate perspective, because we sort of talked about universal access and what that requires. And I think one of the things that we neglect where the US is a lot different from other countries is that I think universal access requires universal taxation. And the US is pretty unique in our history of soaking the rich, taxing the rich, focusing on the 1%, not raising taxes on those under $400,000. And that's just not how any other country taxes. So if you want a more universal access, if you go to the Nordics, they have great access because you have 25% VAT across the board, value added tax. The US is the only country that still does not have a value added tax among rich democracies. And I think that is a policy history that has implications for access to some of these more generous programs at upper end of what we might want to see for parents. On sort of the intermediate end, I'm always struck by just our lack of state capacity issues of just trying to build a functioning website that everyone can access. And Niskanen Center has a state capacity initiative that you guys should all go check out. But this is something we're really interested in. How do you build something like Canada's website where all their employment benefits are on one website? So you go here, here's unemployment benefits, parental benefits, sick leave benefits, all in one stop. And I mentioned Australia has Centrelink. You can go to one place, find all these benefits. Some states have made some strides on this in terms of one-stop shopping for TANF, SNAP, and Medicaid. But there's still a whole lot of work to do. I think legally, states cannot build their paid family and medical leave into their unemployment and benefits programs because federal law requires that you're looking for work. So you have to have two separate programs. So even if you have a state we're sort of continuing to build this clutch. So I think one way that we can make some broad steps forward without becoming a Nordic country tomorrow is just figuring out how do we streamline some of these benefits? How do we do some basic one-stop shopping for an array of family benefits where if you're not eligible for A on the same website, it'll point you to that you may be eligible for B and C. And that's something that it's not very sexy. It's hard to get folks behind that, but there's a good amount of research coming out that says this is really, really helpful for families and for parents and for children.
I can't go next and give Stephanie the last word. You know, I think, first of all, yes to that, Josh. I completely agree with you. This implementation stuff, the very granular implementation stuff, the Recoding America stuff, super important. I'm glad Niskanen is working on it. Thank you guys for pursuing the non-flashy but critically important pieces of things. You know, I'll say, you know, so again, to cite Matt Bruggen one last time, right? And he is about as progressive as you can get. Like, his proposal basically says there should be a minimum benefit, regardless of worker hours requirements, that is set at the federal minimum wage. So that comes out to about $290 a week. It's about, if you for 12 weeks, you'd be getting about $3,500, right? That's about the period you'd be getting if you're don't qualify. That's, you know, to your point, Lee, that's not going to break the bank. No one is running off, I don't think, to Vegas on that, right? Like, it's just Stephanie's one of people making silly decisions. And like, I think that's a pretty reasonable baseline. So it could be good. I think glad you asked that question. Just like name what we're talking about. So yes, I think that idea of there should be some minimum level, and it's just is going to give you the breathing room, right? I've talked in my research to stay-at-home parents who, for example, who don't go to like social gatherings or their churches having because they can't afford the gas money, right? Like, we have way too many examples with all the problems of WIC to talk about another problematic issue, problematic program. You know, if a baby needs specialty formula because they have some kind of allergy, like, that's expensive. And they, you know, again, lower income families may not be able to have get access to that. So now you have more peace of mind and the ability to feed your child, to make sure that they have adequate diapers. I mean, you just can go down the line of the things that build mental breathing room, build physical breathing room, and again, just like provide that floor. I'm glad we talked about that floor of sort of well-being that is going to let the parents focus on navigating those wonderful, wondrous, and incredibly chaotic and challenging early weeks and months of having a newborn. So yeah, I think setting some sort of minimum level in there would really benefit those policy goals. And the thing I think we should reemphasize is, in the end, that's going to end up having the positive knock-on effects societally, economically, and all the other ways we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Elliot. I think that yeah, like, what is sort of the point here? What would be a success, right? I think that what I would love to see is some kind of assurance that, like, yeah, setting a floor, giving Americans the knowledge that they will have money coming in because they have a child, right? And there's a certain amount that they can't fall below, right? There's nothing they can do to mess it up, just for the stability, sort of the reassurance, and then of course also that I think that is the only way I see to both ensure that people can be at home with their kids, with their child in that really critical newborn period, and are not in a circumstance that is like overwhelmingly stressful or isolating, right? So I think, yeah, sometimes we get into discussions about paid family leave, and it's almost always about, well, it's going to help with, you know, keeping women in the workforce, or it's going to boost fertility or whatever it is. But I really think that this is a situation where the goal is just that it has the intended effect of allowing people to be at home with their kids during the early newborn period. That should be the goal, because everybody agrees that that's good.
Thank you so much. And I'll add one vision myself, which is, you know, I think part of the goal here is just, as parents encounter the tremendous uncertainty of what it looks like to have a baby, some of which they can plan for or hedge against, and some of which, you know, the kind of uncertainty that comes with a unexpected NICU stay or a diagnosis, like, they can't, that there's not only the financial reassurance for them, that there's a little bit more of a cushion as they shoulder unexpected costs, but that there really is a national pledge of, we have a certain amount of support for every baby and every family. We don't know all the pressures you'll face. We don't have a backstop that will solve every problem for you, but we want to acknowledge the enormous cost of having a child and that it's worth it, and do a little bit to defray or hedge or cushion that cost. I'm really grateful to have you all here as attendees. I'm very grateful to our panelists. And if you'd like, we'd love to have you check out the full report, bring it to anyone you know writing family policy. And I'm sharing the links for Elliot and Stephanie's work at the bottom, so you can follow their advocacy for families and the way they both, I think, do a great job looking at the broader scope of our policy and the way it looks at the level of the individual, how it changes, parents' freedom or not to live and give to their children what they know they need. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so pleased to have you.
Thank you.